guest this week is Ferhad Ahma. He is a member of the opposition Syrian National Council and has been living in Berlin for many years.
Ferhad Ahma, just as it seemed the peace plan for Syria had failed, President Assad said he would respect the ceasefire as called for by the plan. The UN wants to send observers, but Special Envoy Kofi Annan has described the ceasefire as very fragile. Now, a few days into the truce, what are the peace plan's chances of success?
In recent days, in fact, since Kofi Annan began his mission, the international community has made it clear that the world wants this plan to succeed. It will lead to political change in Syria. But the regime in Syria has played for time again and again. We learn from our experiences. At first, there was a so-called national dialogue process, but that failed. And the Arab League initiative also came to nothing. Now we have an international plan. And we in the opposition believe it's the last chance to find a diplomatic solution in Syria.
So you're doubtful. The international community, not including Russia and China, is also quite skeptical. The US, Germany and France have said outright that they don't trust Assad. What do you think should be done next?
The first thing is the observer mission. There is talk of 30 observers being sent to Syria, but that won't be enough. We would need several hundred to monitor the protests taking place all over the country, to register all the serious violations of human rights that are taking place everywhere, and report them to the Security Council to step up the pressure on the Assad regime. Also, we have to maintain a dialogue with Russia and China so that they don't change their position back to supporting the regime, but keep the pressure on. There's a range of things we need to do to make sure Annan's plan progresses and doesn't end up dead in the water. If the plan fails, we can expect a horrific scenario with a great deal of suffering for the Syrian people.
Those observers are to be unarmed. Do you think that can work?
It can work if they have the right technical equipment. Let's think back to the Arab League observer mission. Those monitors had no equipment at all. That means they couldn't phone media outlets or human rights organizations at will. They couldn't establish contact with ordinary Syrians without being watched by the intelligence services and the police. If Annan can make sure that the monitors have free access to all parts of the country, then having unarmed observers will work. It's not about them being armed or not. What's important is that they should be allowed to fulfill their mission, but the Syrian state will be expected to ensure their safety.
When you say other countries must keep up the pressure, how do you think they can do that, especially Russia and China?
It's entirely possible that if the regime actively hinders Annan's mission, then the issue could go back to the Security Council for a binding resolution. Russia and China would then no longer be able to stand in the way of such a resolution. That would place enormous pressure on the regime, and that would be the last card we would have to play. If that doesn't happen, and if the regime becomes convinced that it can rely on Russia's support, then I'm sure the regime will not hesitate to send troops, tanks, artillery units out onto the streets again to massacre the people in the way it has been doing over the past months. A lot depends on the stance Russia takes. And Russia has a moral responsibility to play a major part and remain open to all the options.
Even the military option.
Well, we are doing everything we can to bring about a diplomatic process that will lead to real change in Syria. A military intervention would have dire consequences for the Syrian population. It would be a difficult mission. So that's why we're so keen for the international community to do everything possible to make Kofi Annan's mission a success. But if it fails, and people are still being killed on the streets, then we in the opposition and the international community must consider alternative solutions.
Da müssen wir in der Opposition, muss auch die Weltstaatengemeinschaft natürlich nach anderen Lösungen suchen.
One example Annan mentioned was a humanitarian corridor, and other humanitarian measures could be discussed to give the civilian population some protection. I think it's too early to talk about large-scale military intervention, and there's no broad willingness among global powers to launch such an intervention.
Und es gibt auch im Prinzip keine breite Bereitschaft auf der internationalen Ebene, so einen Plan, so ein Vorhaben überhaupt durchzusetzen.
The more optimistic scenario is implementing the peace plan and starting a political process. What do you think needs to be done to create the conditions for a political dialogue?
When the people can go out on the streets again in Syria and live their lives in safety and come home alive, that will be a sign the regime has understood that the people really want change. And then, of course, there must be dialogue with the clear objective of bringing about regime change, not the pseudo-reforms the regime has been trying to implement over the past year.
So you would only start the dialogue after Assad has stepped down? Or would you enter talks while he's still in power?
Regardless of when exactly Assad would resign, it needs to be clear from the start that he will not play a role in Syria's future. It's just not possible. He's responsible for the deaths of 10,000 people killed over the past year in Syria. He's the head of the regime. He commands the security apparatus, the army, and the Shabiha, the plainclothes militia responsible for all the killing on the streets. So there won't be any political process as long as Bashar al-Assad remains in charge. We in the Syrian opposition believe he must at least transfer power to his vice president before a political process can begin, or to another person trusted by the opposition. And that person must be given the right to hold talks with the opposition. Talks that will result in regime change.
So you would accept the vice president as a negotiating partner?
That's an interesting question that many people are asking. Of course, the vice president is also part of the regime. But we would accept the lesser of two evils, so to speak, as he doesn't have a military background. As far as we know, he has never commanded any units or issued orders to kill people. And it's the only conceivable and possible way out of this situation.
And who would negotiate on behalf of the opposition? There's no real unity in the opposition. It has no real leader.
Well, we have the Syrian National Council, and there are many other opposition groups outside of the council, and dialogue is taking place. We've now formed a commission of 10 people, half of them from the National Council and half of them from other groups. The aim is to stake out our common ground and to hold a Syrian opposition Congress in 2 or 3 weeks' time, and to come up with a joint policy paper in the end. And then we can call ourselves a Syrian opposition representing all. I don't think it will be difficult to agree on one person to negotiate in the name of the opposition. That's not the problem. The problem is that the regime has never been interested in real talks, in negotiations aimed at bringing about democratic change in Syria.
You're active in Germany as a member of the Syrian National Council. What do you expect German politicians to do in real terms?
Germany has played a major role in the Friends of Syria group at the two conferences, first in Tunisia and now recently in Turkey. We also expect Germany to support the Syrian opposition, both financially and with consulting. We will need support in the post-Assad regime period, in writing a constitution, forming a government, building national institutions, and bringing about reconciliation within Syrian society. Because of its past, Germany has much to teach us about that. But we need to develop on-the-ground projects as well, of course, not just political ones. So Syria needs, and will continue to need, all kinds of support. Germany could be involved on many fronts.
When will it be time for you to return to Syria to help rebuild the society?
After regime change has taken place. That is, when the ultra-police state no longer exists, and when the state, the institution of the Assad regime and the Ba'ath Party are gone. That will be the time to go back. Not only for me, of course, but for thousands of people who have been in exile, sometimes for decades, to help the country recover from 50 years of dictatorship and move towards a pluralistic society. And I believe that day will come very soon.
Ferhad Ahma, thank you.
Ich danke Ihnen auch.